All right, friends and neighbors, I've gotten a lot of questions on this one, so I thought I would do a video about how to actually manage some logical interfaces or some management interfaces. Okay, so here is a topology, right? So this is a management node, and here's a router, and we've got a production node, and then we've got a switch that we are also going to manage. Alright, so we've got a couple of interfaces on the router, so let's take a quick look here. We have two networks. We have the 172.16 network and the 129.21. So this would be maybe the RIT production network, and then we've got a management node here. And the key is that we have two different networks. Okay, so let's talk first about how we might manage the switch. We got a couple of ways to do this. If I was dealing with a whole bunch of switches, now let's do it this way. If I was dealing with a whole bunch of switches, then I would use a management interface, and so, or a management VLAN. So if we take a look at our VLANs, we can see that we have VLAN 1, which is our management VLAN or our native VLAN or our untagged VLAN. And then I have this other VLAN that I created. This is my production VLAN. And in that VLAN, we have our production host here and then our router. And let's see what else we have going on. So now I've got this other VLAN here that is VLAN 172. Now, that is just a regular VLAN. But you can go in here and give this switch an IP address on that VLAN. And this host can have an IP address that's not on the production network. And then we can ping between them. As you can see, my fooling around here. So let's do this. I'm just going to ping. So you can see from VLAN 172 that this is 117 or 172.16.01. So let's see if we can ping that. Now the interfaces all just came up and down. They're green right now, so we should be okay as soon as the ARP tables populate. Okay, so we can ping the switch. Now the mystery here is why am I going to a regular VLAN? I could just as easily have gone to VLAN 1, and in fact, if I had, several other switches out here, I would use VLAN 1 instead. Why? Because it goes over the trunk port, it's untagged, and it's not blocked anywhere. In this case, I didn't, but let's say that I wanted to use VLAN 172 as my management VLAN. The way that you would do that is you would say, well, VLAN 1 is the native VLAN or the management VLAN. So what I would have to do is, something like this. We go int VLAN 172, and, well, maybe I'll show it to you in a second. But before we do that, let's take a quick look at our configuration for the switch. Okay, you can see that I've got a couple of ports assigned to VLANs there, right? 1 and 2 are in VLAN 129. And then we've got 172 here, and I just made it 17 to help me remember which one was the port. And then I've got sort of this configuration here. Now, I'll get back to this IP route statement in a little bit, but we can see that we've gotten a couple of IP addresses on the VLAN. All right, now, back to the idea of the native VLAN. When a switch is all by itself, it doesn't really matter how you're going to manage it, whether it's VLAN 1 or VLAN 2. The point of the native thing is whether or not you're going to tag or untag, and that would be when we have more than one switch. So let's say that I had gone to or connected a bunch of switches together, and maybe via port 24, like that. Well, at that point, I would have to tell the two switches what was the native VLAN for that particular trunk, because that's where all the tagging and untagging goes. And so what I would do is I would say, we can see we got a bunch of commands here, and I would say switchboard trunk, and then native stuff. All right, so that's where I would change and then specify a particular VLAN. But we're not doing that here right now. What we are doing is I am just going to say I've got one switch, and I'm going to manage it via a particular management network. So I'm going to tie my management network to a management VLAN. Okay. In this case, it's not an untagged VLAN. Okay. Well, we've got a router up here, and the thing that we're going to focus on right now is F0/0 has an IP address of 129.21.0.24. So we know that the PC here, my management PC, can ping the switch. So let's see if this PC can ping its default gateway. And so I'm going to say 129.21.0, whoops, yeah, that's right, 0254, like that. There we go. Okay, so that gives me connectivity from this PC up to the router, and I have management connectivity from here to here. So I gave the switch an IP address, and I gave the router an IP address, although one's on the management side and one is not. Now, how do we manage a router? So the management interface or the virtual interface on a router is the loopback interface. So I've done that on this particular router, and we can see that right here I've given the loopback interface an IP address on the 172.16.02 net. And always the challenge is, how do I get from the management interface on the router down to a management node? And the key is routing. Now you can do this with sub interfaces, you can do this with different networks, but if we think about this for a sec, the key is what my management network is, and then how do I do the routing part of it. Now in this particular case, I didn't want to go too complex. So what I did was I took a multi-layer switch and I turned on, I'll show you that here too, I turned on IP routing, right? So we see this. So now the switch has a routable interface. Now I could do this with several different nodes, and I can do this with trunks. There's lots of ways to do this, but the key is how do you figure out the routing? But in this simple topology, this is the way we're going to do this one today. So IP routing, what that means is that this switch now knows how to forward traffic between these two sides. Okay. Now the fun thing about management networks, you can see that I've got this /32 associated with this IP address. It's very common to give management interfaces /32s. Why? Well, they're all on the same network, and if we tell a router that this is your management network and here is your interface, then the router does two things. One is it says, well, anytime I'm going to go to the 172.16 network, I own it on the loopbacks. Well, that's a problem. But if we use /32s, then it becomes a network that recognizes a network of maximum prefix length. All right. Now the next question is, how in the world do I forward traffic to another /32 network that's on the same management network but not on this device? And the answer is that you use routing statements like this. So here I've said, if I want to get to 172.16.01 /32, I want you to forward it to this particular IP address, and that happens to be the switch. So when the switch gets traffic for the 172.16 net, it has a 172.16 net that it's aware of, the management network. And so I have two of those because there are two nodes that are downstream, or at least in this direction. Now, these are static routes. What normally ends up happening is that you would feed this to a routing protocol, and the routing protocol would route those /32s to the other routers and then downstream. So what this now allows me to do, and oh, by the way, let's take a look at what we've got here. Let's take a look at our routing table here. Show IP route. Now, in this particular case, I've got another static route that says, well, listen, if I want to get to the loopback, I want to send it to the router interface, and then the router who owns that particular /32 will dump it off to the right interface. Okay, so let's see if we can get to all of our management interfaces. We know we can get to 01. 02 is up on the router, so we got to do our ARP thing here. There we go. Now I want to show you one other thing that we can do on this host, or that we've done on this host, and that there's no default gateway. And that's because I don't want the router or this management node to be discoverable to or by production nodes. So if I look over here and I go to 172.168.0.99, the traffic might go out, but it doesn't come back because I don't want to forward it there. Now we would take additional precautions, right? We would protect the router from nodes that want to connect to it. So protection for the router might be ACLs that prohibit SSHing from all but a particular address or things like that. But the key here is that we have two networks. We have the 129.21 network, which is our production network, and then we've got our 172.16, which is our management network. We've used loopback, and we've got our management interface on the switch. The only reason I used a tagged VLAN here is because I only have one switch. If I wanted to have more than one switch and manage all of that, I would change the native VLAN or just use VLAN 1 there. The absolute key to getting to your routed or your router's loopback interface is the routing. It has very little to do with being a management interface. All right, so let's just, before we close up here, let's just tick off the reasons why we like management interfaces. If you have a management interface, it's not tied to a physical interface. Now on the switch we have the native VLAN or the management VLAN. There has to be a node alive in that particular VLAN, no matter how you do it, in order for us to manage the switch via that VLAN. On the router, as long as any interface is live, then that loopback is alive and well. And then you just have to handle the routing. Okay, so why do management or virtual interfaces? Well, it's not tied to a physical interface. It's a separate network. In the case of VLANs, we can do this untagged thing. But then loopbacks are often commonly used as router IDs and things like that when we're doing something like OSPF. We can assign a router a loopback address so we know exactly where that information came from because it's not tied to a physical interface that the router chose for its router ID. And then we can propagate that routing information with a routing protocol. So these are all good reasons why we use management interfaces. And there you have it. So on the VLANs, they're untagged. If you choose to use a tagged one, you're still in good shape as long as you're not trying to trunk between multiple switches. And then of course we have the router's loopback interface, and the key to get into that thing is with the routing, however you figure it out. And we're using /32s, and so you have to have those static or dynamic routes to get to those interfaces. All right, there we go. Remember, this is networking. You can do this.